So in this video, I'm going to be telling you how you've been doing D&D wrong and why 15mm scale might be the perfect scale for this game. I will be shrinking down these models, which are already pretty small, and making them even smaller. So let's get on with it. So in this video, I'll be telling you how to take these tiny little miniatures and make them even tinier, how to paint them up, and just some of the benefits as to why this is, in my opinion, a really good idea if you're into D&D. I've done a similar thing in the past when it comes to wargaming and other types of games like that, and I've had an absolute blast with it, but I've never gotten around to trying it with D&D. And recently I had a moment which made me realise that I needed to do this. So Mammoth Factory Games has sent me over sets in their past, and I've printed them all up and I've painted them all up and I've put them on the channel here. And they are just about to launch a new Kickstarter campaign. And they asked me if I could just do a couple of shots of all the models that I printed. And I realised these cabinets behind me are basically getting filled with miniatures, and a lot of you out there are probably going to have the same sort of issue. They don't seem so big when they're like this, but when they're in a big group or a big set, and especially when you throw in terrain and other bits like that in there as well, suddenly you run out of room and your spouse is probably going to divorce you or boot you out. And that's where the idea of the 15mm scale came in for doing these D&D campaigns, but also there's all sorts of other bits there. So before we kick off with the how do you actually do this and how do you paint them and all of that jazz, let's talk about some of the benefits for it. First up, there is storage. Miniatures take up a lot of space, especially when you get into things like 3D printing and you're just printing off loads and loads of bits. You throw in the terrain and all the bits that need to go with it, and suddenly you are running out of space really quickly. And when it comes to space, it's not just about storing them, it's everything else that goes with that as well. So for example, with D&D, you suddenly want to be able to get all your battle maps and everything else to go with it, but then you need a bigger table, you need a bigger play space. But when you come down to that 15mm scale, suddenly you've got a lot more space to do things because obviously you require less space. A big benefit is you can print off something like a battle map on A4 and not have to worry about like blowing it up massively. And instead of using something like a virtual tabletop TV like I use at the moment, you could use something like a tablet and then load all the maps into that, and the minis fit pretty much perfectly on that tablet format. Another big benefit of using something like a tablet is you could combine that with something like Roll20 and have loads of like virtual tokens and stuff on there, and you could even control it because it's all touchscreen, which is, you know, just a nice to have. Now also, whilst we're on the subject of space, it's also easy to transport the entire set that you've printed off. So if you're going to a friend's house, for example, to play some D&D and you're the dungeon master and you've got all the minis and you've got all the terrain, when it's that standard 28 or 32mm scale, it takes up a lot of space and you're going to need quite a lot of storage just to be able to get it someplace. You're going to need boxes, make sure it doesn't get broken. But when it's at that 15mm scale, even with the terrain, it fits into like a nice little shoebox. So it's easy just to throw in there and get it to somebody else's house. Another big benefit is the time it takes. So printing these, they print off so much faster than your standard 32 or 28mm scale, because obviously they're so tiny and little. And whilst we're on the subject of speed, they're a lot faster to paint, even though they might look a little bit daunting at first. You can get through them really, really quickly. So if you're somebody who's subscribed to someone like Mammoth Factory, for example, and you're getting all of your different sets each month, but you just don't have the time to print them off and then paint them and then organize it all and get some terrain to match, well, when it's down to this scale, it's a lot faster and just a lot less daunting to try and get off an entire set. So that's just a few of the benefits, but the question is, how do you actually do it? So the first thing you need to do is find some models that you're going to want to use for this sort of thing. In this case, I'm using one of Mammoth Factory's previous sets, which is part of their Kickstarter, and all of these awesome undead creatures. Now, when you're getting all of your models, ideally you want them to be monopose. If they're coming off in separate parts, you want to try to assemble them before putting them into your slicer and printing them off. Otherwise, you have to try and stick them all together afterwards. Trust me, that's really tedious. I learned from my mistakes. Don't do it. So get all of your models downloaded, and you want the unsupported ones. If you tried to take a pre-supported one and do this, you're going to have some problems. So it needs to be unsupported. Get all your models, throw them into your 3D printing slicing, and then we do some magical maths. And I'm going to pass you over to the math wizard who's going to tell you what that sum is.
So the maths is quite simple really. First you take the scale the models want to be at, so 15mm, and divide it by the scale the model currently is, which is 32mm. That will give you something that is close to what you want. And then you times by 100, and bada boom, bada bing, and all of those mad, fun-fangled things, you have the scale you want to have them down to in your slicer. I hope you enjoy, and I will pass you back over to the attractive one. Farewell.
Yep, that just happened. I'm sorry about that. So now that you have scaled all of your miniatures, you want to make sure that you keep at least one as like your reference mini for the future. So that way, if you go ahead and you do this in the future and you print off multiple sets, you've always got that original mini that you can pop into your slicer at the correct scale and just compare it to any other models. So you've got all your models at the correct scale, and then you just need to use auto supports. Now, some people hate auto supports, but I found in Chitubox and also in Lychee, I've not had any issues with it. Now, I'm lazy, I don't do my own supports just because it boggles my mind sometimes when I have a look at it, but auto supports haven't let me down and they work really, really well on this. So once your auto supports are done, obviously you export them onto USB or however else you do it, pop them onto your printer and leave them. And like I mentioned previously, the 3D printing process at this stage is really, really quick because they are so much smaller than your traditional models. Moving on to this next bit, obviously you need to clean them and get them off the supports, and you need a little bit of patience here. I actually find that they're easier to get off the supports than a lot of the full-size models, which is kind of crazy. But if you do get impatient and you go rough, you're going to break some things. I accidentally pulled a man's leg off whilst doing this, which is apparently it's frowned upon. However, everything else printed successfully on this batch, and it all came off the supports very nicely. I do recommend have a pair of clippers just to do around all the weapons and any legs or any bits that jut out away from the main body of the print, because otherwise if you just pull, and even if you slice with a scalpel, there is a chance you're just going to rip the whole thing apart, so just be careful with that. Once they're cleaned, snipped, cured, and all of that 3D printing goodness, you need to stick them onto some bases. Now, I've just gone for their standard bases that came included, and I scaled them at the same time as doing my models, so that way they match perfectly. One thing that you might find in the actual play sessions is that they can be a little bit small and fiddly to move around, and it might be an idea, it's something that I wish I'd thought of actually before making this video, to actually just bump up the size of the base just a little bit, and it makes it easier to handle the whole model. So just food for thought, and future Sean, if you could do that as well, that'd be fantastic. So now you have your models, it's time to paint them. And this bit, whenever I do anything to do with 15mm scale, people look at it and go, that's crazy, I can't paint that. But actually, it's so much easier than painting a 28 or 32mm model. Now, the reason why I really, really like 15mm when it comes to a scale is you can go smaller if you want, but then it becomes really fiddly and you just lose a lot of that detail. And obviously you can go for the larger size models as well, which is fantastic, and I really enjoy that, but defeats the point of this video. At 15mm, they're small enough to make a considerable space saving, but they also still have pretty much all of the detail that you'd get from your normal 3D print. And that's fantastic for when it comes onto this next stage, which is the painting. And what we're going to do for this bit is we're going to use either contrast paints or army paint or speed paints. Now, first up, you want to do some priming. And in the past, I've always primed them just pure white, thinking that that would make it easier to really pick out all the details, make them vibrant, make them pop on the table. But in my opinion, that's a bit of a mistake. So I like to pre-shade these. So I do a zenithal prime, so black all over, then white from above. Now that might sound overkill when it's coming to these miniatures, but it's much harder to get to all the nooks and crannies on these size things than it is on a standard model. Your brush is obviously so much bigger than the model itself, so it becomes a bit tricky. If you've done that pre-shading to start off with, you don't have to worry about it so much. And because we're using contrast paints and speed paints, you get a lot of that shading that will come through. So my recommendation is go with something like a zenithal prime. So like I said, hit them with black all over, then white from above, and you've done a massive amount of the work already. When you're priming them as well, ideally you want to stick them to something. So I've used an old toothbrush in the past with some blue tack. I'd run out of blue tack, so I figured why not just go for it and try to use less paint and air going through my airbrush at the same time. As you can see from this video, it didn't work. They went flying everywhere, so stick them down if you can. So now that you're at your painting table, a contrast paint or a speed paint is a really good thing to go for because it does a lot of the work for you. It's a nice wet paint and it'll run into all those bits that are hard to hit with your brush. Don't go too mad with the colors. You only need like 3 colors on these minis to actually make them look good. Because remember, they're going to be quite tiny, so it'll be hard for people to see all the details on there, but they're big enough to pick things out. So I recommend about 3 colors seems to do the trick. In this, I just went around my minis, I chose some different speed paints and contrast paints, and popped it onto my minis all over, and just picking out some of the details that I wanted to show up. Once my minis is all dried, I went back in there and I did the bases, and I wanted them to stand out against the mini just because, again, they're quite small, so we're going to need some decent contrast between those. So I went for this like orangey bit, and I'm using Nuclear Sunrise by Army Painter Speed Paint because it's quite a bitty paint as well, so it almost looks like there's some dust flakes in there. And then at the next stage, you just need to leave it all to dry and then come back in with a dry brush. Now I just always use a cream dry brush because I'm lazy and I don't want to pick out different colors, but I find that this works really, really nicely because it just helps to do some of that highlighting and then you're pretty much good to go. You can leave them there or you can come back in with a wash. For this, I used Nuln Oil and I popped it in some of those areas to pick out some of the shadows, and then you are pretty much done. Rimming the bases is difficult because they're so tiny and you've just got to be careful that you don't get things on there, but I rimmed the bases black and that basically completes them. And at this stage, I looked at them, I wanted them to have glowing eyes, but I'm a coward, so you're not going to see that in this video. There's no way that I'm going to be able to do that. One trick I've attempted in the past, which kind of worked on my 8mm stuff, is I used an oil wash and I just like dropped it in there and it kind of ran in, but then it also went around the head as well. So they had like glowing eyes and a glowing neck. And they're probably not going to match the theme I'm going for. As well as doing these minis as well for the D&D campaign, I printed off a couple of houses just to have some terrain there. And like I mentioned, with the minis, it's exactly the same when it comes to terrain. You do the same maths, you do the same process, and they print so much faster. So these houses at 0.12mm layer height, they printed off in like 3 hours each, including the roofs, which is awesome, versus something like 16 hours to do like the whole thing. It's a lot faster doing it this way. And then once you've got them painted, obviously you are now ready to play. And like I said, it's so much easier now because they take up so little space. You can get them to your friend's house nice and easily. You can play on a smaller surface. You don't have to worry about storage quite as much. And you can use other things like an iPad, for example, to have all your battle maps on there. Or just printing off a map is so much easier. If you want loads of terrain, it's so much faster now to print off loads of terrain, and it's not going to cost you a small fortune or take up like a whole, something like a whole, what is that? Shelf. Or take up something like a whole shelf to put all your stuff on there. So in my opinion, it's a great way to do it. And I think when it comes to D&D campaigns and one-shots and stuff like that, I think I'm going to try doing this in the future just because it'll save so much time and it means that I will actually play the game rather than printing bits off and then realizing I've got so much to paint and it's going to take me forever. Now, to put it in perspective, all of these were painted up in like 2 to 3 hours, including the houses. So it's a really fast process and I definitely recommend it. It's a lot of fun. It's a bit of a challenge at first to get used to it, but it just gives you so much more scope to do things. And as I've said in previous videos as well, this translates into things like wargaming or skirmish games, because suddenly everything becomes so much larger in scale in terms of what you can accomplish. You can have a massive battlefield, a massive play map, and just experiment so much more with the maps and the terrain that you're using, because it's so much smaller and it's so much less of a time investment and a cost investment, and most importantly, a space investment. So let me know in the comments below, are you going to try this 15mm scale? Do you already do it? Do you think this is a good idea, or do you think I'm just stupid? Don't answer that last one, that would really hurt my feelings. And I also just want to say a massive thank you to Mammoth Factory for sending over all these things in the past as well. They've currently got an awesome Kickstarter campaign running where you can get hold of all of these miniature sets and all the D&D campaigns as well at a pretty damn steep discount, so it's worthwhile heading on over there. And even if you're not interested, just go check them out anyway. It's always fun to see some awesome sculpts. I'll have all of their Kickstarter stuff linked down below as well, so head on over, have a look at them. And yeah, I love these zombies by them. They have my absolute favourite on, which is this one here. It's Zombie Who Just Stood in a Lego. Who doesn't want that sculpt in their set? So thanks for watching. Hope to see you in the next one. Stay safe. Bye.